My name is Ozzie Haymon Jr. I was born on December the 9th, 1933 in Natchez, Mississippi in Charity Hospital. Uh, I'd like to tell you a little bit of my history before that. The Thornton family, who raised my dad, lived in Vernon Parish near Leesville. And in the 1920s, it was a hardship of living, and they decided to go to northeast Louisiana in the Delta cotton planting and work in the cotton fields to make more money. My grandmother, Lizzie Thornton, she was a Haymon, and she married a Thornton. And she raised my dad and his three brothers because my grandmother passed away when my dad was 10 years old. So they moved to St. Joseph, Louisiana, and lived on Richland Plantation. And they were tenant farmers. And they worked during the days. They would pick cotton or coho cotton or whatever that needed to be done. But the plantation allowed them a few acres to plant on their own. And the plantation managers loaned them the mules and the plows and the equipment to plant cotton, and so they could have a little bit of cotton their own to raise. And so the year that I was born, my dad got a federal loan from the federal government for $60 to buy seed and fertilizer and planted cotton. And I think he probably got a bale of cotton after all the 40 acres he had. Then after the cotton was harvested, he went to work on the Mississippi River levees that was being built by the federal government because of the flooding. He was an oiler on a drag line. And when my mother was expecting me, she had difficulties because she had high blood pressure and had something called convulsions, what they call seizures now. And so when I was coming near to be delivered, they took me to the doctor in St. Joseph, and the doctor in St. Joseph said my mother needed to go to Natchez to where I would be delivered. He loaned my grandmother on my mother's side, Model A Ford that he had, to go to Natchez. And it was the day that this happened, it was sleeting, slight little rain, in the 30s in temperature. When my dad got home from work, certainly they didn't have any cell phones in those days, but somehow he found out they had taken my mother to Natchez. And so he got out on the gravel road and hitchhiked from St. Joseph to Faraday and on to Natchez. He was wearing a little seersucker pair of pants and a little lightweight sweater in the sleet. When he got to Natchez, he decided that he needed to rent him a room for the night, so he had 50 cents. And so all the houses in Natchez looked alike because they were company-built houses. So he rented his room, gave him his 50 cents, and then he went to the hospital to see his newborn son. And he was there for a while, and he left and went back to his room, and he couldn't find the house where he had rented. He walked up and down the streets, he couldn't find his place where he had rented, so he lost his 50 cents. So he went back to the hospital, and they let him stay in the lobby of the hospital that night. And then later on, they brought me home, and we lived on Richland Plantation. This was in 1933 during the hardest part of the Depression, and nobody had any money and little food, and it was just hard living. And we stayed there until 1935. And my grandfather, Cullen Haymon, was pastor of a church in Provençal, Louisiana, which is in Natchitoches Parish. And he borrowed a truck from Brother Ralph Osborne, a man in his church, a 35 model Chevrolet pickup truck. And he came to St. Joseph and loaded us up in that little pickup truck and brought us to Provençal. Now, we had a dining table and a number 7 cook stove and a bed and 2 chairs. And that just barely fit in that little truck was almost like a wheelbarrow these days. But he brought us to Provençal so Dad could maybe find work. Well, there was no work, so they farmed us out. They'd go to one relative for a week and another relative for a week and another relative for a week, and they just kept going until finally Dad got some kind of a job, and we got a little house in Provençal. And but times were very, very hard. But my mother she was a Crossgrove, and her family were Catholic people. And I didn't tell this earlier, but they weren't really happy when my mother married my dad, because they thought he was a holy roller. He'd been raised in a Pentecostal home, but he wasn't nothing. He wasn't in the church, and so they weren't really happy about that. But when we moved to Provençal, we lived there in 1937. There came a revival in the church at Provençal, and J.W. Evans, they called him Red Evans, from Arkansas, had a bunch of children, but he was an evangelist. He come to Provençal and preached a revival. And my mother received the Holy Ghost in March 1937 in that revival. And they had 75 people receive the Holy Ghost in that revival. Several of them turned out to be preachers and missionaries and worked for the Lord all the rest of their lives after they received the Holy Ghost. So things got just a little better. My dad got a job peeling poles. And, nowadays they have a big machine that just runs these logs through these things, peels them. They had a thing that looked like a straightened out hoe, and they shoveled that bark off of those trees. And it was a hard job. Dad would leave the home early in the dark and come back late in the dark. And but he just barely made a living. But in 1939, he got a job with the state on a statewide bridge reconstruction crew. And he made $3 a day, and they paid him $1.50 subsistence when he was away from home. So I don't know how all this came about, but eventually on that kind of pay, he made enough money and saved enough money that my grandpa Cullen Haymon built us a brand new house on a corner right in the middle of Provençal. And that was a real good thing for us. I guess I need to go back and tell you about when I started school. My first day of school at Provençal, I guess it was all high school then. It was a 3-story brick building. We lived in a house called the Haley House. We rented from house to house, but this one was called the Haley House. And between the Haley House and the school was Papa Cullen's house. And so that day, my first day of school, I went walking by that house, and Granny Haymon, Pearl Haymon, saw me going by, and she whistled. Now the school was probably a half a block from her house, but she knew how to whistle and get the attention of her kids at school. And she whistled, and she said, "Normally, go take Junior to his first grade class. He don't know where to go." And so they took me to my first grade class, and that's where I started. Miss Day was my first grade teacher. I liked school. We played dodgeball and all kind of stuff, and it was just a lot of fun going to school. During this time, this is a time where a lot of things would compress, things happening. For instance, in 1941, the maneuvers of military came to Provençal, and all the Kasatcha National Forest was a area for training for combat, and there were hundreds and thousands of soldiers and vehicles, and and all kind of equipment that came to that area. And sometimes at night they would call for blackouts, and we had to put our lights out in the house as if the enemy was coming. They didn't want to see it. All the vehicles that they had to cut the lights off. It was dark. It was just unusual. In particular, one day there was a vacant lot, a vacant space next to our house. In those days, it looked like a football field. I went by there not long ago, and it was just like two lots, about 150 feet wide, and that's where all these maneuvers, they had a bunch of these howitzers, big guns, big 6-inch barrels, and they backed them up against our fence, a bunch of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And the last one, we had a privy. Now, if you young folks that don't know what a privy, that's an outdoor toilet. And this outdoor toilet had a little, on the side of it, it had a little diamond-shaped cutout for ventilation. Well, they parked one of those big old guns with the head, the end of it right against that diamond on that toilet. And my mama said, "We're not going out there." So we had to make other arrangements for that. But the maneuvers was really something else. It was just upsetting our situation in our town. And we had a lot of upheavals and stuff. One day, one of those big army trucks came down the hill from behind our house. They called that Provençal Hill. Came down and had a load of ice, 100-pound blocks of ice. And somehow he didn't make the curve, and he flipped that truck over, and there was a pile of ice. Well, me and one of my friends, Don Marcelli, Don was too young for the draft and too old to be in primary school. He was just kind of an oddball age, but he was really he was strong. He was bigger than me. He was strong. We got a wagon and we loaded up ice. We got an axe and we broke up that ice and we went door to door. And I thought we were selling. We probably gave it away, but we had ice. For everybody in town had ice all of a sudden because of a wreck from an army truck.